Chainmail print hoodie! Chainmail print hoodie? It's very slimming, don't you think? Chainmail print hoodie. It's actually made from an image of authentic riveted mail, very accurate. If you don't get a chainmail print hoodie, you'll be a person without a chainmail print hoodie, and you don't want to be one of those people. Really. Available through my Teespring store, link in the description. This is so cool!
Only a slow-moving blade can penetrate my shield.
Really?
Yeah.
You're right. Good advice.
Shadowversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and the recently released film Dune, which is based off of the book series Dune, has one of my favourite kind of sci-fi ideas, and it's the idea that you could have an energy shield that protects you from long-range fire, even some types of energy weapons, but not melee weapons. And the reason I explain it in Dune is that they need the shield to allow air to pass through. And so they have it that the shields allow slow-moving particles and matter through the shield, but anything moving faster, and I think it's even like 6 centimeters per second, if it's faster than that, the shield will block. And obviously they're very effective against ranged types of attacks, and well, obviously that would change up the idea of combat completely, and that's what I want to discuss. The idea of how would you fight if you had energy shields similar to Dune? Now, Dune is somewhat different because there are different applications of this idea. An energy shield, if it was a bubble, okay, anything outside the bubble, it would block like high, faster moving projectiles and stuff. But then if you got in closer inside the bubble, you could fight normally. But no, Dune's shields actually sit on the surface, okay, and it follows your movements just like this thin extra layer. It will block melee strikes that are moving too fast. That right there is a very significant, small but a significant element that would really affect and change how you would fight. So let's explore this and see if the film, the recent film, depicts it in a realistic way, or if there's a better way, or how would you really do it? So let's kind of break it down. And the first thing to really discuss is like, what would be the best, most optimal weapon to use if you have combatants are fighting with this kind of limitation, but also protection? That nothing moving fast will pass through, including sword strikes. Now, I'm going to mainly be looking at, in terms of my review, how the film visualizes it, depicts it, okay? And if there are some differences with how the movie depicts it compared to the book, I'm going to be erring on what we see in the movie and drawing conclusions from that one. Main reason, I haven't read the book series, but I have seen the film. So there we go. But it is in the book and the film that the primary weapon they use are daggers and short swords. Not long swords with long blades like that. Does that logic play out? Well, first of all, let's even consider the idea of bladed weapons, swords, daggers and stuff, versus other weapons, spears, axes and things. What would be the best weapon to actually use against someone who has a shield like this? To determine which would be the best weapon, we really need to break down what happens when you land a strike. Now, any fast-moving strike against someone wearing a shield is going to be stopped. But what happens after that, okay? Because after it's stopped, well, the blade is stationary. And so any amount of slow movement would be able to get through the shield. And so what you might be looking at then is a weapon that allows for more optimal follow-up strikes after initial contact. Now, you could actually do that far easier, honestly, with a longer bladed weapon versus a weapon that has a shorter cutting ratio. Because if you hit and you want to do a draw cut, well, there's not much blade there to actually do the draw cut. But what if you miss hit, okay, and it lands on the shaft? Well, you're running into problems there as well. What's interesting about swords specifically is they have a much longer cutting ratio, and so you could land a strike on an opponent at any point on the blade, depending where your blade is, you can then actually still do lethal cuts through their shield. You could do a draw cut down, or if you land with the tip, you could do a pushing cut. And if we compare things like spears, well, spears, it's hard to do cuts at all. But if you did, say, a thrust, okay, and then it stops, but then you could slowly slowly push it through the shield and into the person, well, that means thrusting type attacks could still be very effective against people with these type of shields, but you could do that with the sword, and you can do it with the spear. The difference is you don't get the reach that a spear has compared to a sword, but you can get decent reach out of a sword, and then the sword offers you more versatility with slashing and cuts and stuff. And so I do think the weapon that gives you more opportunities to get through the shield would be the better weapon to pick than one that just has a couple of opportunities, because I do think a spear could work, but it can't cut nearly, or some spears can, hewing spears, but it's not as versatile as the sword. And so I actually kind of agree with where Dune has gone. I think swords would be the better weapon to pick when fighting against someone with shields like, we see in Dune. But then we come to the question, what type of swords? Because what we see in the movie is short swords and daggers. Why would you want to opt with that? Let's kind of break it down. One of the ways that you'd be able to get through the shield easier is getting in close. And once you get in close, you have positions where you can kind of leverage, get the blade near the shield to move it slowly through the shield and to attack the person. I mean, that does bring an interesting limitation with longer blade weapons. It's harder to get in close. You can get in close, but look what I have to do to bring the blade back to leverage it and around. And it's harder to manipulate and move this sword around to a different position because of the length of blade. Say I have an arm here, or it's getting twisted up. I need to get it onto this side of my arm or something like that. It's actually in the way. Maneuvering the weapon around is a lot easier with a shorter weapon. You can get in closer and do all things. And indeed, the shorter the weapon goes, the more versatility you have in terms of repositioning it. So daggers and shorter swords actually have an interesting, distinct advantage in being able to do it. Because the other thing is, you want to close the distance to get in close, to be able to get the blade, to make contact with the shield, and then pass slowly through it. Because it's going to be very hard when you're striking and attacking and everything to just do a really slow strike that's just going to move through the shield like there's nothing there. No, because it's easier for your opponent to deflect, block, and hit you. And so your strikes are still going to need to land with speed, but as soon as it hits the shield will stop it. This creates another limitation with longer weapons. Longer weapons are made and optimized to be able to use at a further distance from your opponent. So you can strike and keep yourself further away and safe. But because all fast-moving strikes are going to be stopped by the shield, you then need to either hold it in that position or readjust to move slowly through the shield, which gives the defendant ample opportunity, just knock the blade aside, unless you're so close that it's very difficult to do that. It's a lot harder to put your blade in a position where the opponent can't knock it off their, shield or anything like that if it's longer and you're further away. And they also have leverage, okay? It's much harder to push the sword away if you're pushing from this position compared to this position. If the opponent's just pushing there, they'll be able to get it away. And so that means you will actually have more leverage with a shorter bladed sword when you get in close. Now, you can have better leverage if the strong of the sword is against the opponent, but they have more opportunities. It's easier for them to push aside your weapon. So again, it's interesting. Like, this is one of those films where when I'm looking at it, it's like, that is the way that I would see this to be done. I would see, naturally, shorter swords and daggers being naturally moved towards in terms of this style of combat. Because one of the things that the shield gives you a big advantage on, it protects you in closing the distance. Even if, you really need to get in close and they're going to get maybe a hit or something against you, well, the first, initial faster hits will always be blocked by the shield. And then if you can knock their blade aside and get yours ready to go against theirs, you would naturally resort to closer style fighting where there's a lot more grappling. And guess what? We see that in the film as well. I was watching it, I was like, how would I just, I'll kind of, there we go. So the shield enables you to close the distance, you get in close, and then you want to get the dagger or short sword in some position that will enable you to do a lethal cut. Of course, you need to pay attention to where the opponent's blade is, as we saw in one of the early fight scenes in Dune. It's no spoiler, it's just a practice fight scene or anything like that. The main character is able to pin his trainer down, but he wasn't paying attention to the dagger that his trainer was holding against him, because when you're in close, it's harder to keep track of where your opponent's arms are, and you want to do that because if they have a dagger or weapon that can slowly move through your shield, the advantage that you gained in closing the distance with them is an advantage they have against you as well. I think there would be a lot more disarming happening in these close quarter fights where people would opt to grappling, locks and pins, wrestling and stuff, because the shields wouldn't just affect you know, weapon-based combat, it would affect unarmed combat as well. Technically, the shield would block a punch, just like it would block a strike or a stab from a knife, and so you're not going to be seeing punches and kicking in the type of combat with these shields. You're going to see grappling, locks, and wrestling as the primary thing, and that's kind of cool. And then we would also see it incorporated with the weapon-style combat, where you would be twisting around, trying to get in locks, moving around, really close style combat. And honestly, we kind of see that in the film. I have to give the props in terms of how the actual fight scenes are done. It's not perfect, but overall, in terms of the concept of how they would fight, the movie does a surprisingly good job, and I have to give it credit for it, because when I break down, I kind of reach the same conclusions. Now, it's not to say you couldn't use a longer sword, even fighting against someone with the shield, but think about the unique kind of disadvantages or advantages that exist with it. Because you would think longer sword, reach, okay? You can keep your opponent at bay, especially if they're using daggers or shorter swords, which is the better pick in my opinion, but obviously it becomes the more prominent pick and is more prominent in the film. And so usually in a real fighting scenario, you have a big advantage with a longer sword versus a shorter sword. You will usually be able to land a hit on the opponent easier because you can take advantage of the reach before they can get you. Remember, the shield almost nullifies that advantage because the first strike, unless it's slow, is going to do nothing. And so that means the dagger person can much more easily close the distance, even if you take advantage of your reach and you get a strike or even a stab, and it comes in here, the shield will block it, and then all I have to do is knock it aside and close. And so again, the shield enables closing the distance so much better, and you get some really interesting, unique advantages, because like daggers, if you can close the distance with someone using a sword, get right, chest to chest, it's really hard. You can still damage it, like if you got the sword in between them, did a draw cut or something like that, but it's much, much harder to manipulate the sword to, actually damage the person when they're so close. But then with daggers, whew, and especially they start to employ grappling, when you're really close, daggers have the advantage against longer, bladed weapons. And the shield basically nullifies the advantage of reach, which also means just because spears, you land a thrust and then, hope for the slow penetrating thing. I think it's going to take too long. All I have to do is knock the spear aside and they'll close, which also nullifies the advantage of spears. So even though spears could be used to get through shields, no, there's too many advantages that actually arise with shorter bladed weapons, and specifically blades, because short swords, you can still land a strike like so, and the shield will block it, but you can still manipulate this around much easier, and you can still do draw cuts and pushing cuts and everything, even after you land the strike, the shield blocks, and then slash up or something like that through the shield. And so this is, like it's a short sword, technically a cutlass, but, in terms of lengths, this does fall into the length range of short swords. But you'd still obviously be able to do fencing maneuvers with it. You got, blocking and stuff and all these maneuvers, getting the hits against the shields, slashing, drawing. And so there'd still be sword-like combat, but with more grappling incorporated to it. So that's kind of really cool. So these have been my thoughts on how you would logically fight when you have these really interesting shields where slow-moving, blades and stuff can pass through. And I kind of like that for a change. I come to the same conclusion that, I think you would fight very, well, same how it's depicted in the movie. As because I also have broken down what's the best way to fight with a lightsaber. And interestingly enough, we end up with a very different style of combat that we often see depicted in the movies. But in this one, we come very close to what we see in the movies. But the movie, of course, has more, elaborate, exaggerated choreography to make it look more impressive on screen. But yeah, because it looks better. Like I say, if it looks better and it's still kind of founded on some realistic principles, awesome, good stuff. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed, and of course, hope to see you on the next video here on Shadowversity. So until that time, farewell.